I thought I was alone on the frozen tundra until I heard a sound nails scratching from beneath and the ice. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the surface, and that's when I saw them. Eyes, ancient and unblinking, stared back at me through the frost. They weren't human, and they weren't kind. The tundra was quiet, except for the wind, but I heard it a sound that shouldn't exist here. Scratching. Soft at first, like a faint whisper against the ice. It grew louder, more deliberate, cutting through the howling wind like nails on glass. My chest tightened as I crouched by the frozen lake. I brushed away the snow with gloved hands, revealing a surface so smooth it reflected the ashen sky above. The sound stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Then I saw them, eyes, unblinking, glowing faintly like embers smoldering in the dark. They stared up at me, not just seeing but knowing. The sensation was so visceral, so consuming, that it felt as though they were peeling back the layers of my mind. I staggered back, my breath fogging the air. When I looked again, they were gone. Only my warped reflection remained in the ice, distorted and unreal. I ran, slipping and stumbling on the frozen ground. Every crunch of my boots felt too loud as though something might hear me. The wind clawed at my face, but it wasn't the cold that made my hands tremble. It was the feeling of being watched, even when I was alone. Back at the station, I slammed the door shut and stood in the dim light, my heart hammering in my chest. It was nothing I muttered aloud. A trick of the light, stress, exhaustion. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop seeing those eyes, glowing beneath the ice, ancient and impossibly aware. Deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The station groaned under the weight of the wind, its walls creaking like an old ship lost at sea. Inside, it was warm but suffocating, a fragile bubble of light and heat in an endless, frozen void. Alina barely glanced up when I burst in, my face still flushed from the cold. I saw something. I blurted, my voice trembling. She turned, raising an eyebrow. Saw what? Eyes. Glowing. Beneath the ice. Alina frowned but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and sighed. You've been out there too long. The ice can mess with your head. Shadows, reflections, it's nothing to worry about. Her words did little to soothe me. That night, as I lay in my bunk, the sound returned. Scratching. Faint, rhythmic, and impossibly close. I sat up, straining to hear over the wind. It was coming from the walls. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the dim hallway. The beam of light danced across the metal panels, revealing nothing but frost-rimed surfaces and silence. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I saw at the door. The scratches were faint but unmistakable, a series of claw-like marks, etched into the metal. My breath hitched as I stepped closer, running my gloved fingers over the grooves. Alina, I called out, my voice shaky. No response. Just the wind, moaning like a living thing. I turned back toward my room, but the marks stayed burned into my mind. The station no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a cage, and something was clawing to get in. The morning light was pale and lifeless, casting long shadows across the snow. Against Alina's warnings, I returned to the lake. I had to. The memory of those eyes haunted me, and the scratches on the door had only deepened my unease. The ice looked different now. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, radiating out from the fort center, where something dark glinted beneath the frost. I crouched, brushing away the snow, and froze. And it was a shard of something black and jagged like obsidian, but not quite. It seemed to hum. Faintly, a vibration I could feel in my bones. I reached out and touched it. The scratching began immediately. This time it was louder, more insistent, like claws raking against glass. My heart pounded as I glanced up and saw them. The eyes were back, but now there were more. Dozens of them. They stared up from beneath. The ice, unblinking, their faint glow pulsating in unison. The cracks in the ice seemed to widen, as though whatever was beneath it was straining to break free. I stumbled back, clutching the shard to my chest. The whispers began then, faint but unmistakable. A chorus of voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. They weren't just in my ears, they were in my mind, crawling through my thoughts like parasites. I ran, the shard burning cold against my skin. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. By the time I reached the station, I was gasping for air, my body trembling. Elena was waiting for me, her expression a mix of concern and irritation. "What happened?" she asked. I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I could think about were the eyes watching from beneath the ice, and the voices that had begun to burrow into my mind. The shard sat on the station's workbench, a sliver of black that seemed to absorb the dim light. Watched as Elena examined it, her hands steady despite my frantic explanations. "It's not from." Here I insisted, my voice sharp with desperation. "It's something else." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned the shard under her microscope, her face a mask of forced neutrality. "The composition doesn't match anything in our database," she admitted. "It's ancient, and it seems to emit some kind of energy. But you're jumping to conclusions." Conclusions. I swallowed hard. I saw eyes under the ice, Elena. "They're connected to this thing. It's not just energy, it's alive." She laughed nervously, shaking her head. "You're starting to sound like one of those Inuit legends. The old ones, trapped beneath the ice. It's just a myth, Jack, nothing more." That night, the myth felt all too real. The scratching returned, louder than ever, echoing through the walls like nails on glass. I sat bolt upright in my bunk, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then came the whispers, soft, indistinct, like voices murmuring just out of reach. "Elena," I called out, my voice breaking. She appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "What is it now?" "Don't you hear it?" I demanded, the fear spilling from me. The scratching. The whispers. Her expression shifted, her eyes darting toward the ceiling. "No," she lied, her voice a whisper. But her trembling hands gave her away. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, until it felt like something was just outside, trying to claw its way in. When it stopped, the silence was worse. We sat in the dark, breathing heavily, waiting for it to return. And it did, with a whisper that spoke my name. The storm hit before dawn, a wall of white that buried the station and severed our connection to the outside world. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the walls and drowning out our thoughts. "Elena, the signals are dead," I said, setting down the useless radio. She nodded grimly, staring out the frost-covered window. "We'll ride it out. We don't have a choice." That night, the scratching became pounding. Something heavy slammed against the walls, shaking the station's foundation. The symbols came next, etched into the frost on the windows, intricate patterns that glowed faintly before disappearing. "Elena," I shouted, pulling her to the window. "Do you see that?" Her face turned ashen as she nodded. It's just the frost pattern," she stammered, but her voice was hollow. I wasn't convinced. "You can't explain that away. This is them. Whatever's under the ice, it's trying to get in." Elena tried to brush me off, but she couldn't hide her fear anymore. Later, I caught her staring out the window, her breath fogging the glass as her eyes searched the storm. "Something moved out there," I whispered, stepping up beside her. "What?" "A shadow," I said, my voice barely audible. "Tall, skeletal, and its eyes." She didn't let me finish. "Stop. Just stop," but she didn't move from the window, and neither did I. We stood there, watching the storm rage, knowing something was out there waiting. The shard became my obsession. I couldn't let it go, couldn't stop touching it, turning it over in my hands as though it might offer answers. Every time I held it, the whispers grew louder, clearer, pulling me back to the lake. Elena tried to intervene. "You need to sleep, Jack," she said, her voice tight with concern. "You're not thinking straight." "I can't," I shot back. "Don't you see? This thing, it's the key. It's calling to me." But I wasn't the only one unraveling. Elena started hearing things too. Footsteps echoed in the hallways when we were both in the main room. Shadows moved at the edges of the light, flickering just out of sight. She never admitted it, but I saw the fear in her eyes. One night, the front door was wide open, snow piling in. "Did you?" I began, but the look on her face answered the question. Neither of us had opened it. "Elena," I whispered, stepping toward the door. "It's inside." She shook her head violently. No, it's not. You're imagining things." But as we shut the door and locked it tight, the whispers came again, louder than before. This time, we both heard them. They weren't calling just my name anymore, they were calling hers, too. The storm eased, but the silence that followed was worse. It pressed against my ears like or wait. I stood at the station's doorway, clutching the shard. Its pulsing had grown stronger, more insistent, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. "Elena, I need you to come with me," I said. My voice was steady, but inside I was trembling. She didn't argue this time. Maybe she sensed the futility of it. Maybe she felt the same pull I did, a compulsion that wasn't entirely our own. The trek to the lake was suffocating. The air felt wrong, too heavy, too charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. The ice looked worse than before. Fissures stretched in, jagged patterns, and beneath them, those eyes. They were everywhere. Dozens, maybe. Hundreds. Glowing faintly, each one fixed on us. "Elena," I whispered. But she was already staring, frozen in place. The shard in my hand pulsed violently, like it was alive. The whispers that had been faint before erupted into a cacophony, a roar of voices that didn't belong in this world. My head swam as the ice beneath us groaned. Then it broke. The cold hit me like a wall, stealing my breath as I plunged into the freezing water. My limbs were leaden, my vision blurred, but I saw it. It was massive, skeletal, its limbs impossibly long. The glow from its eyes lit the darkness, and its voice wasn't a sound, it was a presence. It filled my mind, showing me horrors that felt older than the stars. "Release me." The words weren't a request, they were a command. Elena's hands grabbed me, pulling me back to the surface. Behind me, the ice cracked further, and the creature began to rise. The creature followed us. It didn't walk, didn't crawl, it moved in ways that defied reason. Its form distorting and flickering, one moment distant, the next right behind us. Webb burst into the station, slamming the door shut. The walls shook as the creature's presence bore down on us. The lights flickered, casting the room into a sickly, stuttering glow. "Elena, it's breaking free," I gasped, clutching the shard. It was ice cold against my skin. It's pulsing now, a relentless thrum. This thing, it was imprisoned. And this, I held up the shard. It's part of the cage. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. "If it's breaking free, what do we do?" I didn't answer. The creature's shadow moved outside the frost-covered windows, its glowing, eyes boring into the room. "Elena," my voice was firmer now. "I have to return it. To the lake." "No," she said sharply, stepping toward me. "You don't know what will happen. It could kill. It could kill us both." "It's better me than both of us," I said quietly. "If I don't, it will destroy everything." The walls groaned as a claw-like appendage slammed against the station's side, leaving deep gouges in the metal. There was no time to argue. "Elena, lock the door behind me," I said, meeting her eyes. "Don't follow me, no matter what you hear." She opened her mouth to protest, but the station shuddered again, cutting her off. I stepped out, into the snow, clutching the shard. The creature's shadow loomed ahead, waiting. The lake was alive now, its surface undulating as if it were breathing. The fissures had spread, and through them, the creature was emerging. Its skeletal form was immense, its limbs twisting, unnaturally as it clawed its way upward. I stood at the edge, the shard in my hand trembling violently. The creature turned its glowing eyes to me, and my legs buckled under its gaze. The voices in my head became a deafening roar. "You cannot stop me." "I have to try," I whispered. With every ounce of strength, I stumbled forward, onto the cracking ice. The shard grew heavier. With each step, its pulse sinking with the creature's movements. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest. The creature's form loomed above me now, its towering frame blotting out the gray sky. It reached for me, its skeletal hand stretching impossibly far. I fell to my knees at the lake's center. With a final, desperate cry, I plunged the shard into the ice. The reaction was immediate. The ice glowed with an unnatural, searing light, and the creature let out a roar that shook the earth. The fissures began to close, the ice repairing itself as the creature's form was dragged back beneath the surface. But I could feel it pulling me too. The shard's energy latched onto me, drawing me into the light. "Elena," I screamed, turning toward the shore. She was there, her face pale with horror. "Run," I whispered, the word barely audible over the roar. Her scream was the last thing I heard before the ice sealed over me, and the world went silent. I don't know how long it's been since the ice closed over me. Time doesn't work the same here. The darkness is endless, pressing in on all sides, and yet I can still see those eyes glowing. Faintly in the void, never blinking, always watching. I thought I would die when the shard sealed the creature back into its prison. But I didn't. Not really. I'm somewhere between life and death now, suspended in this frozen abyss. The creature is here with me, its massive, skeletal form moving just out of reach, its whispers coiling through my thoughts like smoke. "You didn't stop me," it says. "You only delayed the inevitable." The ice around us groans, splintering in ways that shouldn't be possible. It's rebuilding itself, but it's unstable. I can feel its prison weakening with every passing moment, and I can feel myself weakening too. Elena. She's out there, isn't she? I hope she got far away from this place. But part of me knows. She didn't. She wouldn't leave. She would stay, watching the lake, waiting for a sign. And I think the sign is coming. The shard, God help me, the shard, it isn't gone. It's back in her world, buried under snow and ice, calling out to anyone who will listen. I can feel its pull even from here, like a thread, connecting us. Someone will find it. Someone always does. I don't know who will read this, or if these words will even make it out. But if you've made it this far, I need to warn you if you hear scratching in the walls, if you see something glowing beneath the ice. Run, because it's watching. It's always watching. Are you sure you're alone right now, as you finish this story? Or is something watching? You too? If you dare, share this story, but remember, every retelling brings it closer to you. The closer it got, the more I realized it wasn't just dragging a skeleton, it was its own. The sound of bone scraping against rock echoed in the stillness, each step more grotesque than the last. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, pleading, as if it wanted to tell me something, far worse than what I was already seeing. My name is Evan, and I've always believed that the forest was my sanctuary. That illusion shattered the night I saw something impossible. No one believes me, but I can't forget. The sun was sinking fast, the last rays of light casting long shadows across the trees. I was packing up my camera after a long day of hiking when I noticed the quiet. Too quiet. No. Bird song. No rustle of leaves, just an unnatural, oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. Then I heard it. A faint sound at first, like a soft scrape. It grew louder, rhythmic and deliberate, echoing through the trees like a saw against stone. My heart pounded. The noise came from deep in the woods, far off the trail. Every rational thought screamed at me to leave, but Something about the sound tugged at my curiosity. I walked toward it, gripping my flashlight tightly, my breath coming in short bursts. The forest seemed to darken with every step, the trees closing in around me, and then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, hunched and trembling. Its skin was pale and taut, like it barely fit over its frame. But the most horrifying detail was what it dragged behind it: a skeleton, connected by sinewy tendrils of flesh that stretched and tore with every movement. The scraping sound was the skeleton's jagged bones scraping the ground. It stopped, its hollow eye sockets locked onto me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It opened its mouth and released a low, guttural moan. That was when I finally snapped out of my trance and bolted, heart racing, praying I could outrun whatever nightmare I'd just seen. The forest had always been my escape. After weeks of sleepless nights and the suffocating stress of life, I thought hiking would clear my head. I'd grown up near these woods and knew them like the back of my hand. Or at least I thought I did. I packed light, just my camera, a flashlight, and some snacks. The trails were familiar, the forest sprawling yet comforting in its quiet isolation. I spent the day photographing deer and birds, feeling that rare sense of peace I'd been chasing. But everything changed as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The golden light faded, and a strange, unnatural stillness settled over the woods. No wind, no birds, nothing. My skin prickled as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then came the sound. It started faint, a rhythmic scraping that I could barely make out over the ringing in my ears. At first I thought it was an animal, a bear, maybe, or a deer. But the sound grew louder, more deliberate, like bones grinding against stone. I should have left. I should have turned back and run for the safety of my car. But something about the sound felt magnetic, tugging at my curiosity. Against my better judgment, I stepped off the trail and moved deeper into the woods. The sound grew clearer, and with it, a suffocating sense of dread. My footsteps felt too loud, my breathing too sharp. The forest around me grew darker, the towering trees casting shifting natural shadows. That's when I saw the clearing up ahead, faintly lit by the last traces of daylight. I swallowed hard and stepped forward, heart pounding, drawn toward the sound that I'd regret ever following. I stepped into the clearing, my flashlight beam cutting through the dim, hazy twilight. At first, all I saw were trees and shadows. The scraping had stopped. Then it stepped into view. The creature moved awkwardly, its hunched form trembling, as though every step pained it. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over thin, angular limbs. But what caught my breath and nearly stopped my heart was what it dragged behind it: a skeleton. At first I thought it was a separate figure, but then I noticed the sinewy tendrils of flesh connecting the skeleton to the creature's back. The bones rattled as they scraped along the forest floor, the sound cutting through the silence like nails on a chalkboard. My flashlight wavered as my hands shook. The creature paused, turning its head toward me. Its face, if you could call it that, was a hollow nightmare. Empty sockets stared at me, yet I felt them pierce through me as though it could see into my soul. It opened its mouth, releasing a sound that didn't belong in this world: a low, guttural moan that echoed through the clearing. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead. My chest tightened as the thing took a step toward me. Finally, adrenaline surged through me, snapping me out of my trance. I turned and ran, crashing blindly through the trees, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, the scraping started again, steady and relentless. The forest seemed darker, the path twisting and unfamiliar. No matter how fast I ran, the sound followed, keeping pace, an ever-present reminder that I wasn't alone. And then I saw it again, just ahead of me, as though it had somehow moved faster than I could. I screamed and veered to the left, deeper into the woods. The scraping sound followed me, relentlessly. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. I didn't even realize I was crying until I stumbled onto the cabin. It loomed out of the trees like a forgotten relic, its windows broken and its roof sagging. It wasn't safe, but it was. Something a barrier between me and that thing. I shoved the door open and slammed it behind me. The stale air inside was thick with decay, a rancid smell that made me gag. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and rusted tools hung crookedly on the walls. I didn't care. I shoved a rickety chair under the doorknob and collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. The silence inside the cabin felt heavier than the forest. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then I heard it again, the scraping. This time it was right outside. The sound circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, like it was testing the walls. My body froze as I pressed my ear to the door. A voice low, guttural, and impossibly close whispered, "Why do you run?" I stumbled back, my heart pounding. My eyes darted around the room and landed on a journal, sitting on a dusty table. I snatched it up, flipping through its brittle pages. The handwriting was frantic, the words disjointed. One line stood out: "Do not trust the creature. It seeks to bind you to its curse." The scraping stopped. I held my breath, listening. Then, from just outside the window, the voice came again, softer this time. "You cannot hide." I didn't wait. When the sound moved to the far side of the cabin, I threw open a cracked window and climbed out, landing hard on the ground below. My flashlight flickered as I ran into the trees, the forest seeming to close in tighter with every step. The scraping followed, louder now, closer. The shadows around me stretched and twisted, their shapes resembling skeletal hands clawing at the earth. My flashlight beam danced erratically, catching glimpses of twisted roots and gnarled branches. My chest heaved, my legs threatened to give out, and then I saw it, an old cemetery rising out of the darkness. The sight of the open space gave me hope. At least here I could see, but the relief was fleeting. The gravestones were crumbling, many of them half buried in the earth. One, larger than the rest, drew my attention. Its surface was covered in strange carvings, and an inscription below sent a chill through me: "Bound by bone, cursed by flesh." The sound of scraping grew louder, reverberating through the still air. I crouched behind the large gravestone, clutching the journal I'd taken from the cabin. My hands trembled as I read more of the frantic writing. The creature wasn't just a monster. It had been human, cursed to carry its skeleton for eternity as punishment for betraying an ancient ritual. A twig snapped. I looked up, my blood turning to ice. It was there, standing at the edge of the cemetery, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The scraping stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then it spoke again, louder this time, its voice cracking like a broken bone. "You cannot run forever." The creature stepped forward, dragging its skeleton behind it. Each movement sent a shudder through its body, the tendrils of flesh pulling taut and snapping with wet, sickening sounds. Couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my breath caught in my throat. Then it lunged. I bolted, my instincts taking over. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me to navigate the pitch-black forest by sheer luck. The trees seemed alive, their branches clawing at me, their roots tripping my every step. Behind me, the scraping sound followed, joined by a series of sharp cracks. I risked a glance back and saw something impossible. The creature wasn't following, conventionally. Its skeletal limbs detached from its body, flying through the air and embedding themselves in the trees around me. One of them whizzed past my head, slamming into a trunk, with enough force to splinter the bark. Panic surged through me. I didn't know where I was going. The forest seemed to twist and shift with every step. My foot caught on a root, and I fell hard, sliding into a pit. Bones, hundreds of them, surrounded me, their jagged edges cutting into my skin. I scrambled to climb out, my fingers slipping on the damp earth. As I pulled myself free, the creature was waiting. It loomed over me, its hollow eyes unblinking, its voice a raspy whisper. Take it. Take the burden. Its skeletal hand reached out, the tendrils stretching toward me. I screamed, pushing myself back until I hit a tree. The thing didn't move closer. It just stood there, its empty sockets, watching me as if waiting for an answer. Take it, it repeated, softer this time, almost pleading. I turned and ran. The forest felt like it was folding in on itself as I ran. The trees blurred together, their twisting, branches forming shapes that clawed at the edges of my vision. My chest ached, my legs trembling with every step. But I couldn't stop, not when I could still hear it behind me. I stumbled into a clearing so suddenly it was as if the forest had spit me out. My flashlight flickered over a massive stone altar at the center, its surface dark and uneven. My stomach churned as I realized the stains weren't moss or weathering, they were dried blood. Carvings covered the altar, crude and violent depictions of skeletal figures tearing themselves free from their own flesh. Each line seemed alive, writhing under the dim light as if the stone itself was shifting. I froze when I heard the sound again. The scraping. It was softer now, almost gentle, but somehow that made it worse. I turned slowly, and there it was at the edge of the clearing. The creature. But this time it didn't lunge at me. Instead, it dropped its skeleton with a sickening thud and collapsed to its knees. Its trembling voice filled the air, broken and mournful. End it. Or take it. My heart pounded as the journal's final words burned in my mind. To end the curse, you must finish the ritual. But failure will spread the curse to all who enter these woods. The creature's hollow eyes followed my every movement as I approached the altar, its tendrils of flesh quivering like they were alive. End it, it whispered again, softer this time. Please. My fingers brushed the cold surface of the altar, the carving seeming to pulse under my touch. My hands shook as I stared at the altar. The journal's warnings ran through my head in a frantic loop. Finish the ritual. Break the curse. But it hadn't told me how, or what might happen if I failed. Behind me, the creature stirred, its rattling breath filling the silence. I turned and saw it watching me, its hollow eyes almost pleading. Its skeletal hand reached out, shaking, as though offering itself to me. Take it, it rasped, the words echoing like a death knell. I felt a bone-deep chill as I turned back to the altar. The carvings seemed to move under my gaze, the skeletal figures writhing in silent agony. My pulse thundered in my ears as I grabbed a shard of bone from the altar, its jagged edge cutting into my palm. The blood came quickly, dripping onto the cold stone. The moment the first drop hit, the forest came alive. The ground beneath me trembled, and an ear-piercing wail split the air. The creature screamed, its body convulsing as it collapsed into a heap. The tendrils connecting it to its skeleton began to snap one by one, releasing a thick, black smoke that curled toward the full sky. For a moment, I thought I'd done it. I thought the nightmare was over. Then I heard the whispers. They started faint, just at the edge of my hearing, but they grew louder, surrounding me. I stepped back, the ground beneath me feeling less solid. When I looked down, I froze. I no longer cast a shadow. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, and I stumbled out of the clearing, the sense of something unseen clinging to me. The curse wasn't gone. It had just found a new host. I stumbled out of the forest as dawn broke, my legs trembling, barely able to carry me. My clothes hung in tattered strips, my skin covered in scratches and dirt. My body was wrecked, but that was nothing compared to the storm raging in my mind. I kept telling myself it was over, that I had escaped. But even as I limped toward my car, parked at the forest's edge like a lifeline, I could feel something clinging to me. It wasn't physical, but it was heavy, a presence, a weight. Something I couldn't shake no matter how fast I moved. When I finally reached home, I didn't feel relief. I locked every door and window and left the keys in the lock, double-checking each one, as if that would somehow keep out what I knew was already inside. My home, once a sanctuary, felt foreign. Every corner seemed too dark, every shadow too long. The air felt colder than it should, heavy and thick, pressing down on me. The whispers started that night. At first they were faint, just a murmur at the edge of my hearing, almost easy to dismiss as my own mind playing tricks. But as the hours crawled by, they grew sharper, clearer, worming their way into my thoughts. They weren't in the room, they were inside me. Words I didn't understand, echoed through my skull, spoken in a voice that wasn't mine. Take it. End it. Take it. I tried to drown them out with noise music, the TV blaring, my phone playing anything loud, or enough to block out the whispers. But it didn't work. They slipped through, always there, always waiting, repeating themselves like a broken record. The shadows in my house began to move, first in subtle ways that made me doubt my sanity. A flicker in the corner of my eye, a shift where nothing should have shifted. Then they became bolder. They stretched unnaturally, twisting up the walls and across the ceiling, bending and contorting in ways that defied logic. It was in the bathroom mirror that I saw the first undeniable proof that the curse hadn't stayed in. The forest. My reflection stared back at me, its eyes just slightly off, too wide, too dark. I blinked. And it blinked a moment too late. I raised a hand, and my reflection followed, but its movements were sluggish, like it was struggling against an invisible force. Then its mouth twisted into a smile, sharp and unnatural, while mine stayed still. I shattered the mirror with my fist, the shards raining down onto the sink. Blood dripped from my hand, but I barely noticed. The broken pieces of glass still reflected the twisted grin, each shard, a tiny fragment of horror staring back at me. The nights were worse. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the forest. I could feel the cold altar beneath my hands, hear the creature's voice, see its hollow eyes burning into me. The memories didn't fade, they grew stronger, more vivid, replaying themselves in excruciating detail. But it wasn't just memories. The bones started to appear. It began with a rib cage under my bed. I found it while trying to convince myself to clean up, hoping a little order would chase away the chaos in my mind. But as I pulled back the bed frame, there it was, perfectly intact, freshly unearthed, dirt still clinging to its surface. Then there was the femur, leaning against my front door like some macabre offering. I opened the door to grab the morning paper, and there it was, upright and clean, its jagged end pointed at me like a silent warning. The skull was the worst. I found it in the shower, waiting for me as water dripped from its hollow sockets. Its surface was slick, wet, as if it had just been pulled from a fresh grave. It didn't move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that I was losing my grip, that my mind was cracking under the weight of what I'd seen. But no matter how much I tried to reason with myself, the bones didn't disappear. If anything, they multiplied. Small pieces began to show up. Everywhere, phalanges in my shoes, vertebrae on my desk, fragments of ribs scattered across the floor. I stopped leaving the house. I thought isolation might help, that shutting out the world would keep the curse contained. It didn't. The shadows grew darker. They didn't just move now, they pressed closer, wrapping themselves around me like tendrils of smoke. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, unable to breathe, with the distinct feeling that something was sitting on my chest. My skin would prickle, and I'd feel hot breath against my ear. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Yesterday, I saw her. She was walking along the road toward the forest, a camera slung over her shoulder, her steps light and carefree. She looked just like I had that day, confident, unaware, heading straight toward the nightmare I'd barely escaped. I ran to the window, my hands pressed against the glass. I tried to shout, to warn her, but my voice caught in my throat. It felt like something was gripping my neck, squeezing, choking the words before they could escape. I could only watch as she disappeared into the trees. Moments later, I heard it again. The sound that will haunt me until I die. The scraping of bones against stone. The whispers are louder now. They no longer come and go, they are constant, filling every moment with their dark, insidious presence. The words have changed, too. They are no longer unintelligible, I understand them perfectly. The burden is yours. You will take it. I feel it now. The pull of the curse. It's in my shadow, which stretches too far, even under dim light. It's in the way objects move just slightly when I'm not looking. It's in the unnatural chill that lingers in every room, no matter how high I turn up the heat. I know it's only a matter of time before it takes me completely. The curse doesn't die. It doesn't disappear. It waits, spreading, growing stronger. As I sit here writing this, I can feel it closing in. The shadows are darker than they were an hour ago. The whispers are louder, more insistent. My reflection in the window isn't looking at me anymore, it's looking behind me. Are you sure you're safe as you read this? Do you hear something faint in the distance, a scraping sound, like bones dragging against stone? If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings it closer. You're safe for now. But how long can that really last?